Welcome back, everyone, to the final session of Peatlands Gathering 2021. My name is Paul Johnston. I'm a boglands hydrologist, if you call it that, and have spent many years looking at hydrology of a variety of wetlands. But I just mentioned that I remember the day we set foot in Clara Bog over 40 years ago, on the Dutch having bought the bog from Bord na Móna, but on condition that we figure out how it worked. And here we are 40 years later, and we're still at it. But I think we have an awful lot more understanding now of the way things work. And the final session indeed is devoted to mainly to the engine room, if you put it that way, of peatlands, and that is the hydrology and how to manage that, which of course involves as well the intervention of people, and particularly at the community level, as people have mentioned. So without further ado, and I just remind people that if you want to put questions, please do put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we'll try and deal with them at the end. So without further ado, we'll start with Patrick Morrissey from the Environmental Protection Agency, a long-standing member of the hydrological community, and he's going to talk about peatland restoration and achieving Water Framework Directive objectives. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so my name is Patrick Morrissey, and I work in the catchments unit in the EPA. And yeah, I suppose this talk is kind of focused on what we do in the catchments unit, which is generally related to Water Framework Directive and some of the interactions we have with peatlands. So yeah, I'll just move on to the next slide. So yeah, the EPA assists the department to provide scientific evidence base which underpins the River Basin Management Plan. The River Basin Management Plan process is a 6-year cycle, and we're currently coming to the end of the second cycle and starting into the third cycle, which will run from 2022 to 2027. In terms of cycle, the EPA are responsible for a number of components. The first is monitoring and undertaking our status assessments, which allows us to look at progress and the outcomes achieved. And where we identify there are problems, we then have to assess what's causing the problems and how we fix them through actions and measures. That then allows us to consider environmental objectives, which essentially means achieving at least good status in all of our water bodies. And we assist the department in doing a technical assessment of environmental objectives before they're signed off from the minister. So we're also responsible for reporting and the provision of public information. That's mainly through catchments.ie, and for assisting with the program measures and tracking progress of the implementation of these measures. So the map here gives an overview of the current ecological status, which was from 2013 to 2018. You can see there are significant issues. With 47% of our rivers and 62% of our estuaries in an unsatisfactory condition. The problems are widespread, and these have been, we've seen a continuing decline in our high status water bodies, and are in, and an increase in our poor status water bodies. We've also seen kind of a shift from some of our good status water bodies to moderate status. So overall, I guess there's a lot of issues that need to be resolved. So on the last slide, I mentioned that one of our tasks is to undertake characterization of our water bodies. And in terms of this characterization assessment, the first thing we do is look at the risk of a water body not achieving its environmental objective. So we examine the evidence base, which comprises of a huge amount of data sources, and we then assign significant pressures to all water bodies that are deemed to be at risk. And the graph here shows breakdown of the various significant pressures affecting our water bodies. You can see that peat extraction and drainage is a significant pressure in almost 7% of the total number of at-risk water bodies for the third cycle. We know that there are other water bodies where peat extraction and drainage is potentially an issue, but we don't currently have sufficient evidence base required to place them at risk. And those water bodies are therefore on a list which will be reviewed during the third cycle. The main impacts from peat as significant pressure are organic pollution. I guess what I mainly mean there is ammonia and BOD. Alteration to habitat, hydrology, or physical alteration, and fine sediment. So for the third cycle, peat has been identified as significant pressure in 106 water bodies which are at risk, and it's predominantly river water bodies. And the map here on the left shows the spatial distribution of these water bodies across the country and also their most recent status. You see they're mainly concentrated in the Midlands along the western part of the country, and you'll also see that many of these water bodies are at less than good status, particularly those in the Midlands. Plus, I have to point out or note that peat is not usually the only significant pressure for these water bodies, and sources of problems for water bodies with impacted status are often a mix of multiple pressures. So can be actually quite complex to tease out what the driver of the issues are in terms of status. You can also see some detail here on the right on how peat significant pressures have changed between the second and third cycle. I suppose a lot of shifting and changing around as risks change and as status is improve and decline. But I suppose the overall message is that there's been a net reduction in peat pressure water bodies for the third cycle. We carried out a detailed change assessment where we examined the drivers behind changes in status, and we did identify 2 water bodies which improved status, and this is mainly due to cessation of Bornemona peat commercial extraction. So we can see there the potential that exists for water quality status improvements in this space.
2 minutes remaining, Patrick.
Okay, yeah. We also did find that private peat extraction was also a driver in recent status declines, so continuing work in this area is required during the third cycle. So just, I suppose, in terms of what we do, we interact in terms of Water Framework Directive with our colleagues in license enforcement. We currently have 9 licenses for peat extraction, and Bornemona, I suppose, have ceased extraction, but the conditions of those licenses include the need for monitoring and rehabilitation prior to license surrender. And the EPA is engaging with Bornemona on this rehabilitation, mainly through the PCAS scheme. Currently have 19 rehab plans approved, and the rehabilitation of the bogs will play a vital role in restoring water quality and achieving our environmental objectives under the Water Framework Directive. We've also identified that peatland restoration provides a huge opportunity for multiple benefits other than water quality, or co-benefits, I suppose, in terms of biodiversity, climate change, and flood control. And we currently have a project that's looking at nature-based catchment management and a framework for implementation nationally. Obviously, significant issues still remain for unlicensed private and commercial peat extraction. I guess that they've been highlighted by other speakers here today, and will be as well, I presume, tomorrow. So just, I suppose, one other area that involved in terms of peatlands is research and advocacy. The EPA has and continues to actively fund research in the area of peatlands and peatland restoration. I'm currently, I've given an example of 2 projects that I'm currently involved in terms of steering group for swamp and water pre. We also have another project related to the PCAS scheme, which hopefully will be starting up next year. EPA is also a member of the Irish Ramsar Wetlands Committee, and we also support the Community Wetlands Forum. The role of the Ramsar Committee is to assist in the protection, appreciation, understanding of wetlands in Ireland and promote implementation of the Ramsar Convention. So I guess essentially we advocate for the wise use of wetlands, which obviously means restoring them when they've become degraded. And a significant number of our peatland sites across Ireland, which are SACs, are also Ramsar sites, including Clara Bog, Nephin, Blanketbox, and Peatlands Fen, to name but a few. And an example of some of the recent work that the Ramsar Committee have involved in is producing promotional videos to help the wider public appreciate the value of our Ramsar wetland sites. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We'll move straight on, I think, to Ray Flynn, and from Queen's University in Belfast, another long-term wetland bog hydrologist, and particularly now going to talk about blanket bogs. Where does the water flow? Over to you, Ray.
Thank you, Paul. Hopefully, can you hear me? A thumbs up will do. Yeah.
Yep, fine.
Okay, very good. Okay, basically, this is a present. Obviously, I'm doing the presentation here, but it's not the only. I'm not the only person that's contributed to this work. This was work that was sponsored by the EPA, and there was a large contribution to this work made by Francis Mackin, who works with me in Queen's, and then Florence Renault-Wilson, obviously in UCD, and we're all familiar with the work that she's been doing, which is excellent. Okay, so very quickly, a lot of what's been presented already sort of takes away from what I have in this slide. So some of the slides I'll go through quite quickly. The first one actually is just basically what I'd like to do, and I'd like to look at where blanket bog occurs. Now, this is nowhere near as good as the slide that John Connolly presented earlier, but if you take a look at the purple in the slide, it gives you an idea of blanket bog coverage across the island of Ireland. And what you'll see there is, A, it's really quite extensive. B, particularly as you go further east, it's more dominated in upland areas. But C, if we were to overlay this with some meteorological maps, what we would notice that roughly, everything that's to the west of the 1,000 millimeter ISO height for the average annual rainfall would essentially be would host large areas of blanket bog. The other critical element I'd like you to bear in mind with this is that, generally speaking, these same areas will experience over 200 and typically over 250 rain days per year. So in other words, we're getting a lot of rain. It's not particularly intense compared to other parts of the world, but it's falling very frequently. And that's really a critical thing to bear in mind with blanket bogs, because what we see is that those critical slopes that we would see for the development of peat accumulating communities in the raised bogs, which are really quite gentle, typically 0.3 to 0.5 degrees, they can extend up to 10 degrees on blanket bogs simply because that rain and that input is coming so much more frequently. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how important water can potentially be. But despite that, what we found what we see over the years is that there's been quite a significant amount of attention given to bog hydrology in Ireland, but most of it has been devoted towards raised bogs, in those lowland settings. And blanket bogs, in some respects, are the poor cousin. So the EPA quite kindly decided that they wanted to fund some blanket bog hydrological studies, and more specifically, they wanted to look at how blanket bog behaved under relatively intact conditions. In other words, with minimal human disturbance. So in this presentation, I'd like to go through some of this work that we've done and some of the findings that we come across. So before we go any further, this is almost heretical to ask at this stage, but why should we care about bogs? I think we've heard many reasons throughout today. But of course, you've got very significant coverage. I have about 13% of the island of Ireland covered with blanket bog. That would be north and south. It's a major carbon reservoir. And it's also a significant reservoir for aquatic and terrestrial biodiversity. And I'll come back to the aquatic issue in a moment, touching on some of the issues that Patrick brought up earlier on. Other things that make it very important, it's a major source of drinking water. Peatlands supply significant amounts of drinking water, and I believe Shane mentioned the figure of 70% earlier on. What I would draw your attention to on the map here on the right, the pink is basically Irish water, drinking water catchments. But what you'll see is that in the eastern part of the country, very few are covered or contain blanket bog, with the exception of that area which is occupied by the Wicklow Mountains. And bear in mind that that is the significant water source for the city of Dublin. So this is an extremely important resource that we need to look after. So we got large volumes of water supplied by these blanket bogs. And then we've also got another side to this, which is that very often we look at flooding and we attribute that to peatland degradation. But is the condition of the peatland actually responsible? When one thinks about it, and particularly when one thinks about the water levels that we're considering, water is already very close to the surface in peatlands. So, surely there must be limited capacity and then a limited ability to provide water, to dampen flooding under those circumstances. So to look at this in a bit more detail, our research looked at the condition of blanket bogs in Ireland at the start, and the news, I'm afraid, was not good. We looked initially at 1,400 catchments. We then whittled that down to the 300 best, if you will, and these are largely illustrated with the yellow outlines here on the map on the right-hand side. Of those catchments, we identified less than 10 that had no visible indication of human disturbance, and that would be forestry, drainage, burning, overgrazing, that sort of thing. When we went out and site then, we basically found that even those sites that we had shortlisted also had evidence of human disturbance. Put another way, the conclusion we came to was that there is no single catchment in the island of Ireland greater than 1 square kilometre that is not damaged by human activity, blanket bog covered catchments. So what we basically then decided to do was focus on those near pristine catchments. But please bear in mind that when somebody tells you that there's an Irish blanket bog catchment that's intact, treat that with a certain level of caution. And what we also saw by comparing current figures with previous ones is that there's been significant degradation over the past 20 years. So we've got degradation. What's the problem? Well, one of the issues here, of course, relates to the Water Framework Directive, as we say with Patrick, and this is an excellent figure that Cormac Connigly put together out of the Blue Dots program, and he's kindly provided that to us. And what you'll see here is the loss in high-stated sites, and that is also reflected with the proportion of blanket bog coverage. So what we're seeing is degradation of peatland intimately linked with loss of high-status sites.
2 minutes remaining there, Ray.
Oh, great. I'll slip through this. Okay, so what happens if we don't look after blanket bogs? Well, we basically got loss of habitat, we've got water quality degradation, and we've other nasties like this. This is the bog slide at Drumkeeran that Mike mentioned earlier on. So to better understand what's going on, essentially what we need to do is look at bogs and understand how they sit within the landscape and in relation to their geological setting. And what we've actually seen is that if we go through the earlier literature, essentially the blanket bog was viewed as an isolated entity with little to no influence or relationship between it and the underlying materials. We basically set out to question this, and the way we did this was by integrating our geology with some water quality and hydrological data. And what we saw was that, not surprisingly, within the peat, we have very poorly mineralized low-level waters with low levels of ions. Yet when we looked at what we were seeing in the runoff, particularly at low flow, we had very ion-rich water. And the only way that this could actually be explained was by water seeping through the peat and coming into the underlying material where it reacted. And what we basically were able to conclude here is that we've got pretty much a constant driver. The head or the water level in the peat doesn't vary all that much. So we're driving water through this peat at a pretty much constant rate. It's coming in, it's flowing through that peat, and then it's coming out in the stream as the more mineralized water. During the wetter periods, that's then getting diluted with water that's flowing via shallower pathways. Those pathways in healthy bogs are actually relatively slow. In other words, the rain falls, it may take a few days or even a week or so for all of that rain that was flowing through the peat to come out into the stream. What we see then is with degradation that we have a change in that regime. We see that the water flows off much more quickly. In other words, we get the same amount of rainfall, but that rainfall basically leaves the catchment more quickly. And that raises the level of flood risk. On the other hand, at low flow, we have much lower levels of bog water contributing to stream flow. And what that means is that that constant input of the more mineralized water is basically not getting as diluted as much. And that can have pretty adverse impacts on terrestrial and on aquatic ecology. And we see an example of this here from County Sligo, where basically we have an area of closed canopy forest on peatland, on deep peat. And what we're essentially seeing here is just highly mineralized water that is not getting any dilution from the less mineralized water going into streams and essentially coating stream bottoms, delivering iron oxyhydroxides and having a negative effect on the aquatic biota. So that's a very brief overview of what we've been doing. If you want to know more, there is a Bing video and there's also a written summary, and that's EPA report 378. And just out this week, we also have a paper in the Journal of Hydrology reporting some of this work. We hope to have an additional paper shortly published in Hydrological Processes on this as well. If you want to contact me, please drop me a line at that email address there. Thank you. Youthled, if you could just exit there, please.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was really interesting and a very concise description of the issues with blanket bogs, which are so significantly different in many ways to raised bogs, and as you said, very much a forgotten sister. Can we move on to a people end of the bog hydrology, and that is by Kate Flood from NUIG Galway, and the title of her presentation is Peatlands Connecting People, Engaging Communities and Supporting Collaboration for Peatland and Community Wellbeing. Over to you, Kate.
I think you might be on mute, Kate.
Sorry, thanks, Isolt. Thanks for that. So I'm going to focus in this presentation, obviously, on communities and collaboration. And I think what has been called the glue, I think it's a good description. And it's, sorry, it just sometimes sticks. There we go. So collaboration is one of the big four goals of COP26 and working together to deliver. So accelerating action through collaboration between government, business and civil society. And, you know, for much of the 20th century, the state and the market have dominated how we organize our societies. And the new thinking is about bringing society to the fore, as we've heard from many people today. And that would be with the state and the private sector enabling civil society both to act and to experiment and prioritise social and ecological benefits and well-being rather than, I suppose, economic goals such as GDP. And Kate Raworth talks about it in her donut economics. That's just one of the kind of models. So in terms of Peatlands Connecting People, I borrowed the title from a Facebook page called Lichens Connecting People, which I think is a lovely concept that such a small symbiotic organism could connect 5,000 people from all over the world in this online community. And sometimes when we talk about engaging communities, we think in terms of local communities. But I suppose a recent definition would extend beyond human society to include other species and the earth and the bog itself, what the Earth Charter calls the wider community of life. And Shirley alluded to it earlier in sort of the rights of nature conversation. So we have, as we can see from today, we have so many different types of communities or stakeholders, if you want to call it that, who are engaged and engaging with peatlands in Ireland. And just to note, the etymology of the word engage is actually to pledge or promise something. So, you know, we have local academic practitioner agencies, business, all these communities making up this very complex social system, as well as obviously the complexity of the ecosystem that we've been hearing about. And the ecological communities, of course, as well. So we did a recent Water Forum report. We tried to just do a stakeholder map, which was a first step in mapping all of these communities and organizations involved with peatlands. But we also need to look at the relationships between the communities and how they're connected or not connected. So again, that glue that we were talking about before. And the relational approach and focus on communities is reflected in kind of paradigm shifts that have been happening in ecology over the past couple of decades. And, you know, ideas of ecosystems as complex adaptive systems, which humans are a part of. So you have this social and ecological system together. And the youth-led Repeat Collective, I'd like to give them a shout out because they talk about a peatland paradigm shift. And in terms of what that might look like for how we do conservation, it's more participatory, inclusive, community-led. We've been hearing about all of this today, including the social sciences and other disciplines. Knowledge is acquired from multiple sources, including local, not just expert, and just generally more place-based and based around local needs. And, you know, it's not an either or scenario, it's more like a spectrum, and it's more like we're adding the right-hand column to the left-hand column. And really, as we've seen today, it's that partnership and collaboration approach that is, you know, more and more becoming the norm. But still, there are, you know, some conservation initiatives that are more focused on managing the environment rather than also managing the kind of people environment relationships. So I'm going to look briefly at these three ideas for how we can take a more collaborative approach to support it between all the different communities, enabling civil society and recognizing the role of culture. So the first one, I'm just going to take a shortcut and direct you to the Water Forum report, because that was our priority one, enhancing collaboration with stakeholders. And, you know, it mentions things like supporting existing peatland networks and bridging organizations as well. The state enabling civil society, again, it's that the relationships between all these levels across and vertically and horizontally, the glue, if you will, and alongside that crucial investment that we need for all the research and restoration projects, we need to invest in those social aspects. So, you know, building trust, facilitation, learning, young and old people, and strengthening those networks so we have that kind of cohesiveness that we're all working together on the same page. And just a project that I'd like to mention, the Just Transition Programme Connecting Communities with Peatlands. It's an example of this, and, you know, it's local people leading, you know, facilitated and coordinated by a paid staff member and members of the Wetlands Forum, informed and advised by professionals and scientists, supported by local authorities and NGOs, and resourced by all these different agencies. And the launch for the project is on the 18th of October, I think, so you can find out more about that on the website.
2 minutes remaining there, Kate.
Thanks, Emer. So finally, the role of culture. And I think this iceberg model is very useful for, you know, visualizing the kind of more visible aspects of culture that we all know, like arts and literature, but it's the deeper cultures that we are less aware of that can be more influential on conservation. And it includes things like our attitudes to authority, to justice, our values around leadership, how we solve problems, how we make decisions, our relationship to nature, what we consider valuable, or even our attitude to growth and what we count as progress. And to facilitate reflection on these cultural values, we need to embed this in peatland projects, because it does impact how transformative change happens. And, you know, we need to support the emerging cultures of participation that are happening from the bottom, from the bottom up, but also changing institutional cultures where there's inertia or inaction or maybe a lack of accountability or transparency. And because we're embedded in culture, we need to be aware of its role, because it takes time to change these kind of public values and institutional cultures. So in terms then of what sort of peatland cultures we'd like to hand to the future generations, I think we've seen with Chris's presentation a really best practice example of that. And my own work with Abbeyleix Bog, Gurley Bog and Scohaboy Bog, you know, is looking at those kind of examples of cultural change at grassroots levels. And you know, it highlights very much the health and well-being aspect of peatlands for communities and of communities for peatlands, because it is a reciprocal relationship. And, you know, there's a lot of work in terms of citizen science and volunteering happening there. So I'll just go to the final slide then. So my three, I suppose, recommendations are, you know, to give real attention to and support for collaboration between all the different peatland communities and networks and stakeholders that are there, as many projects are already doing. So harnessing that collective power, the state and the private sector enabling civil society, and recognising the role of culture and values, both past and present, and visible and invisible. So culture is to society what memory is to individuals. In other words, culture indicates traditions that tell us what has worked in the past. So it really shapes our responses and solutions to a lot of these problems. I'd just like to finish, if I may, by mentioning the Bogcast, which is a podcast about bogs, and it's an initiative of the Peatland postgraduate group, and we are hoping to get it online. So just listen out for more of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. It was really a reflection of how important, as you said yourself, about the people as the glue in all of this. And indeed, I think was a nice response to Chris Wye's plea for the need for bridges to the more state-based expertise. More to come, I'm sure. Moving back a little bit to the engine room of hydrology and how that runs wetlands, we come to Professor Laurence Gill from Trinity College in Dublin, and a talk on ecohydrology of peatlands.
Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully, can you all see the screen? You can hear me?
Yep.
Yep, great. Yeah, so my name's Laurence Gill. I work in Trinity College. I describe myself, I guess, as an environmental engineer. I also work in the ICRAG SFI Research Centre. So in Trinity, we, and more particularly Paul Johnston, who's just been speaking for a long time, have been looking at the ecohydrology of particularly raised bogs and fens in Ireland, and people like Shane Regan and myself are his acolytes, and we followed on carrying on some of this work. So I'm going to describe some of the work we've been doing recently, and over the years, a lot of the the research has been funded by the EPA and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Oh, yeah, that worked. So we've just finished this EPA-funded Ecometrics project, which the idea was to come up with metrics, both water quantity and quality metrics for different wetland communities, and you can see the three different types. We were looking at raised bogs, fens and turlocks. I'm not going to talk about turlocks too much because they're not traditionally thought of as peatlands, and the raised bog side of the project was really following on in parallel from this EPA research project that we were carrying out, that didn't have a fancy acronym, unfortunately. So this shows, for example, this is a photo of Ballymore Fen in County Westmeath, and this is the habitat map of that. And this gives a flavour of some of the different hydrological and hydrochemical type research that we've been doing on these fens, bogs and turlocks, as you can see on the map, over the last 4 years, and I'll get back to that. But first, I just want to give a little context as to how we try to understand the hydrology, and then later why it's important to the ecology. So this diagram would show quite a traditional view, I guess, of how the hydrology works on a raised bog. I mean, generally, it's thought to be fairly isolated from the groundwater, at least in terms of groundwater flow. But certainly, research by Paul Johnston and Shane Regan on Clarabog has shown that it is supported hydrostatically. So the groundwater is certainly an important, very important component of how the raised bogs work. When it rains, a lot of the water flows very quickly through this surface, the growing layer. So this green layer that I've put in here is supposed to represent the growing sphagnum aquitone layer out to the edge. In the fens, conversely, the groundwater is actually flowing into the wetland, and so therefore the water quality is affected by the geology, and that has a big difference to what goes on in the raised bog. Equally, when it rains, you have this living layer, and the water can move very quickly across. So the response to rainfall from these systems can be very sharp. So what we need to do is to understand the inputs into the system. So rainfall, obviously, but the role of groundwater, either directly or indirectly. The flow pathway through these wetlands, so through this living layer predominantly, and that's not well researched in my opinion. So how quickly can water move laterally through these systems, and then the outlets, is it coming diffusely off the side or in discrete rivers, etc. And then from a water quality perspective, the nutrients, where are they coming from? How do they get into the system? Are they cycled around, etc.? What are the conditions within the bog? So I mentioned the word redox here. Is it oxic conditions or anaerobic conditions? This all impacts on the chemistry and therefore the ecology of the bogs. So a lot of work we've been doing is picking different vegetation communities of across these different wetlands and monitoring things like water level. So these are water level duration curves, which show for a particular type of community. So this is on the bog. I think this was talked about earlier. These so-called ecotopes. So the central and subcentral ecotopes are reflective of good vegetation, growing bog vegetation, and this shows that for about 50% of the time the water table is at or near the surface, and for 90% of the time it's around about within 10 centimeters. So this vegetation obviously needs water to be close to the surface, and poorer quality bog vegetation you can see has lower water tables. That's one aspect that's important. The slope is also important. So I think Ray was talking about in the Blanketbox, because they have more frequent rainfall, it's been topped up quite a lot, that the slopes can be steeper. But for this good quality vegetation, we found that the slopes have to be quite flat to sort of slow down, if you like, the movement of the water to constantly keep this very saturated condition. And then the other aspect is water quality. So we've look at a lot of different things, particularly nutrients and different contaminants into these areas, how they may impact on the vegetation. So just to show the impacts maybe of drainage on a wetland. So first of all, you could have a drainage on the wetland, and so just to show, so you can see the previous water table there in the blue dotted line. If you start to cut drainage channels, what it does, it brings down the water table, and therefore this area above is no longer flooded or saturated to the same level as it was before, and that's going to degrade the bog. Equally, and this doesn't have to be for a fen, this could be for a bog as well, drainage outside of the wetlands, so this could be maybe a quarry that's been developed, it could be several kilometres away, may impact on the water table and therefore change the hydrological condition of the bog, and then this will impact on the vegetation. So this is a type of research that we do to try to understand the hydrology and then the impacts on the ecology. So
2 minutes remaining there, Laurence.
Okay, so this changes water level durations and has these consequential impacts. In terms of the restoration of raised bogs, which has been talked about a lot, so this type of information is very valuable, of course. If you're aiming to grow these types of vegetation, you need to know their ecohydrological conditions that they like, and then this has to be translated into work on the ground. So this is an example in All Saints Bog where Bord and Amona are creating these series of dams, but what level do they have to be at, what length between them, which is affected by the topography, etc., which is very tricky, as is being found out, I think, to try to establish these threshold conditions. So the type of research we've been doing. Oh, sorry. We need to quantify the meteorology, particularly the rainfall, etc. The flows through the wetlands themselves. So this is what we were doing on Abbey Leaks, trying to work out how fast does the water move laterally, the groundwater levels, and the outflows. And then from that, we've converted these into certain metrics. So, and there's a lot of detail on this, but basically we've looked at this is for fens, good quality and bad quality sites in these different fen communities, and looked at, is there a difference, for example, in water level or in terms of phosphorus, and come up with bands that we can say, look, you know, the good quality fen vegetation seems to be within this band compared to poorer quality. And then the final point, as a big part of the project, was, can we use remote sensing to monitor the health of these systems? So we first of all started off using Sentinel-2 satellite data, which has a resolution down to about 20 meters, and we came up with a methodology which fairly reasonably picks up. This is again a sort of an image of sort of poster bog, Clara bog, but we did it across many bogs, fens, and turlocks in Ireland to pick up the vegetation. And then following on from that, to get higher resolution, we've developed this this nested methodology, but whereby we use a drone to get much more kind of in-depth information at known sites, like ground truthing, the good quality vegetation versus bad, etc. And then we can use that to upscale to the satellite. So all this is going to be in this new report, the Ecometrics report, that's hopefully within the next month or so will be published by the EPA. That's it.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Lovely picture of a cobweb there, which really explains the hydrology well.
Captures some moisture.
Yeah, but it does. I mean, it does really emphasize the importance, as others have done before you, on the importance of monitoring to try and get a handle on not only the condition of peatlands now, but how effective future attempts at restoration is going to be. So thanks for that. And if we move on to a slightly different form of monitoring on Blanketbox by Heather Lally, next from Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, GMIT. And the talk is on determining monitoring and assessment tools for blanket bog pools and lakes in Wild Nephin.
Hi guys, can everyone see it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect, great. So this afternoon, I just want to introduce two new projects that one that has just started and one that's a year old that are ongoing within the Wild Nephin National Park, and just gives you a flavour of some of the work that is beginning to start in that region. The first one is an EPA funded research project determining monitoring and assessment tools for blanket bog, their pools and lakes. So this one has started last year, so we're about a year in. And really the area that we're looking at is the Wild Nephin National Park, so quite a large national park in northwest Mayo, currently at 15,000 hectares, predominantly composed of Atlantic active blanket bog, so quite a unique area. And now within this park, we also have 4,000 hectares of former Quilcha site that comprises Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine. So two very different, I suppose, habitat types together. What we're really focusing on is the aquatic habitats within this region and their water, and then the animals that are living within them. So the focus is looking at this expansive area of active blanket bog habitat, and then more, I suppose, focused within that is looking at these natural dystrophic lakes and pools. Nephin is a stronghold for these habitat types within Europe, so it's really important that we get, I suppose, a sense of what's up there. Surrounding the whole area, there's also a broad network of sensitive rivers and streams. And so the research across the two projects is really looking at this interconnection between the lakes, the streams and rivers, all while kind of, I suppose, looking at it within the context of this active blanket bog habitat. So the region really, from an aquatic point of view, is a biodiversity hotspot, and there's quite a lot of rare and endemic species to the region. So important in terms of, I suppose, understanding what might be there so that we can conserve it. In terms of looking at the dystrophic lakes and pools themselves, from an EU Habitats Directive point of view, their conservation status is currently unfavourable and inadequate. And that really stems from, I suppose, a lack of monitoring in terms of a specified monitoring programme. And of course, that leads to then there's really just a lack of data. Any projects that occur within, say, traditionally or previously on lakes or pools within peatland catchments, even across the country, they're really not classified according to the EU Habitats Directive. So whether they would be, in this case, a dystrophic lake or pool, which will be 3160. So it's very difficult for us to know when we're looking at previous data whether it actually applies to these lakes. One of the key things, I suppose, that's most important for us is that there's really unknown natural variability. Here I've given an example around the chemical characteristics, but also when it comes to the biological characteristics. A key factor would be looking at colour. We know when we're out on these sites, we come across lakes and pools, we expect them to have a darker colour water compared to lakes we might find in the Midlands. But we're not really sure what that variability is expected to be. So whether things are good or whether things are bad, and whether that's natural for that particular lake or pool. And then it's made a little bit more complex when we look at things like stressors. And particularly stressors for Nephin would have been historical overgrazing by sheep. And then there's also the adjacent forestry, but now also there's forestry within the national park itself. So it's really trying to understand, well, what are the variables in terms of from previous data that we have in terms of our historical data. But then it's like, well, what might the variables be in the future in a changing world, particularly around climate change? What are we expecting to occur in Northwest Mayo? And how does that then influence what we expect our chemical conditions to be? And again, what will we assume to be good or bad or natural for those regions? So as it currently stands, the conservation status is made of a combination of expert judgment and maps. And of course, we're just trying to fill in some of the gaps around this to see can we get a more robust approach. So to do that, the project aims are twofold. It's really to look at the area from a holistic point of view and to understand the dystrophic lake habitat structure and function. And that's actually becoming a little bit different depending on whether it's classified as a lake or a pool. So that would be important. And from that then to propose solutions that better inform the conservation status and the management of these lakes so that we can get to a favourable conservation status. So to do that, we're looking at a number of monitoring and assessment tools. And these are by no means new to all of us. These are really common monitoring tools under the Water Framework Directive. And so it's just trying to see, with the tools that we already have, can we modify them for dystrophic lakes and pools? So traditionally, we have water chemistry and macrophytes that have always been monitored on these sites. And now we're adding in different elements such as phytoplankton, we're adding desmids, diatoms, zooplankton, and then macroinvertebrates. But more specifically, we're looking at coleoptera and odonta, and trying to look at these communities and then compare them with what we have at European and member state red list species to see if we can identify sites that can be then prioritised for conservation status. We're also going to have a look at some of the biological and biodiversity metrics. Again, can we pull out individual components that might help us monitor these sites fast, essentially, and in a better, robust way in the future.
2 minutes remaining there, Heather.
Perfect. So the expected outcomes will be a database of historical information, and then we'll add that to what we're doing at the moment in terms of existing data. So we'll have an idea of what was there prior, what's there now, and that might give us a little bit of an idea of how we can better plan for the future in terms of restoration needs. The idea is that we have a baseline that accounts for what's happening there now, and that we build then in our lake characterizations and our conservation management works for the future. and that we can identify priority environmental conditions and measures that we can use to monitor and assess whether these systems then are reaching favourable conservation status or not. This will comprise a monitoring tools, so we'll have a look at some of the tools and see what ones best suit. And if phytoplankton is one of the ones that pops out as a tool that we think will be useful in the future, we're looking at developing an automated algae ID tool, so it doesn't become a huge laborious task to look at these communities in the future. Just to finish, the second project that we're working on in Nephin is looking at biodiversity conservation and restoration in the Wild Nephin National Park. This is a Marine Institute Cullen Fellowship, and this has just started, so it's kind of like its kind of first outing. The key aims of this project are to provide a strong evidence base for aquatic biodiversity conservation and enhancement activities within the park. So again, very similar to what we're doing with the lakes and pools, try and capture as much information in the regions where restoration is targeted, so that we have a baseline from what we can compare essentially. Then monitor planned ecological restoration techniques that are put in place. And we're really looking at here is targeting ecological functioning benefits for salmonids. So this will focus on the larger lakes and then the river and stream networks. And hopefully at the end, propose solutions that can better integrate the Nephin Forest, which is the 4,000 hectare quilcha site that has been integrated into the national park, and kind of align that a little bit better with the conservation and management goals of the park as a whole. So just to summarize, aquatic habitats are an integral part of the Wild Nephin National Park, and data specific to the dystrophic lakes and pools structure and function is required if we're going to try and increase their conservation status to favourable. And equally, we'll need baseline data of the current conditions that are within the park if we're going to be able to compare and determine the success of planned conservation and restoration works in the future. So you can get in contact with myself, there's my email, and also you can follow project updates on our website, and we're also on Twitter. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can get in contact with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was very interesting, and I think very important work, because the status of small lakes like that on Peat is really unknown, because there's nobody officially responsible for determining that status. And as some of you may know, there's the question of who should be responsible in a legal sense has actually gone as a question to the European Court of Justice at the moment, because we have so many of these lakes. Finally, and certainly not least, Flo Renew-Wilson is going from UCD, as you know, is going to come and talk to us about improving water from managed bogs.
Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me and see?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we are nearly done. We're running just a little bit of time, so I'm going to shorten mine, I think, because we have seen already quite a lot of work, which I just will briefly refer to. I just wanted to start again with a slide. We've been shown several times today that the majority of our Irish bogs are managed. Okay, so they're managed for a land use, and by area we have forestry that comes first. Let's remind ourselves actually that Quilcha is the biggest landowner of peatlands, so they'll be talking tomorrow. But then we have agriculture and then peat extraction. So we ought to know know a good bit about managed bogs and managed peatlands. And remember, bogs are wetlands. So obviously, when it comes to manage bogs, we ought to know a lot as well about drainage. And Laurence showed a great schematic there of what happens hydrologically when you drain a bog. So the schematic on the left there now is just what happens far wider to the consequences of draining any kind of land use, for forestry, for agriculture. So what we've seen now, this is well documented. It exacerbates climate change, it destroys biodiversity, historical artifacts, it increases the risk of fire, it pollutes the air. But we mostly also, what I've been looking at recently is that we've been polluting our water courses. And no matter the land use, the water quality from Irish managed bogs has been degrading significantly over the last century. And this was mainly specifically like management activities such as in large scale intensive industrial, obviously peat extraction, which means that large peat bogs were exposed to the elements just with nothing between the water and, you know, and the peat. So ditch and sediment pond cleaning, but also in forestry, not to forget, you know, activities such as clear felling, which have damaged the quality of water courses. So regardless of the land use, what we found is if you change your bog to such land use, you will affect negatively your water. So Patrick already mentioned that we have a water problem in Ireland, and that the peatland sector, the peatlands, especially in the Midlands, but not just the Midlands, Donegal, Mayo, Galway have also a huge issue with our water bodies due to peat pressures. So why? Water is the blood of the bog. So when drained, you remove all the components of life. Carbon molecules, nitrogen, phosphorus, all the things that the plants took in when they grew on the bog, and when they died, they kept it in the peat for millennia. If you remove that water, the peat is now decomposing, just like the leaves outside your window at the moment in this lovely soft autumn day. The bogs are the peat is decomposing. The thing is that we're going to have winter, and then we're going to have spring. Bogs, drained bogs, are stuck forever in autumn. They just autumn constantly fading away, leaching away until there's no more peat, because you know it has to be re-wetted if we want to stop that decomposition. Oh, and there's more, because contaminants and heavy metals that the bogs had naturally filtered when it was growing are also being released now with this drainage. And if it wasn't enough, we have to deal with the consequences of having now brown water as a source of our drinking water, and Shane mentioned that, and the financial and health impacts of cleaning brown water in our drained peat-covered catchment must be addressed, because this is quite unsustainable in the long term. And also it's likely to drive exceedances in, for example, trihalomethane, which have been associated with negative health impact. So what can we do about all this? Okay, it seems all very grim. So as part of the two EPA-funded projects, we are investigating these issues of water quality, especially in two land uses: peat extraction, so that's in the swamp project, and in the reform water project, we're looking at forestry. So in both projects, we are not only getting a baseline data sets of the situation, we are also testing solution to improve water quality. And we have found that from drainage, from drain sites, we have different management possibility, and all of them involve somehow managing the water table, okay, in order to the peat. There's also other ways to technological purification system that we also are looking at. And guess what? That is exactly what we've heard, and you'll hear tomorrow, that rewetting and managing the water table is also good for climate and biodiversity, and also all the sociocultural ecosystem. So what are we finding? So this is the beginning of those projects. So we only have early results, but just to share with you some data there, because we had very little data, unfortunately, even many decades of Bonamona and other peat industry, very little data were officially published. So what we have here is for the water that is coming from the bog itself. Okay, so this is the bog before it's leaving the bog. We found that the water from the drain extracted bog is consistently higher in conductive ions, dissolved nitrogen, and critically dissolved organic carbon.
2 minutes remaining there, Laurence.
Thank you, perfect. And then if you look at this schematic on the left there, we also looked at the pre-bog and post-bog. So pre-bog are the streams that we have monitored before they're being met by a bog stream. And what we found there was also interesting for the starters is that even the pre-bog status were very poor in the Midlands in general. So we have very poor water quality in general. But the peat extraction sites are really contributing negatively to the quality of the water, because this increase in dissolved organic carbon. So we have brown water coming out of joining those streams, and you know, that carbon, don't think it's just going to stay there or go to the ocean. This carbon is very short-lived in the river. It's going to be mineralized very quickly and return into CO2 into the atmosphere as CO2. So in the reform, just other solutions other than monitoring other than raising the water table is to use biochar purification system. We've been testing that in Galway on a site managed by Greenbelt, which has been Clearfeld, and we are expecting results here now. We were waiting this. I'm glad to see rainfall, because we want to see a bit more rain and see how it's managing the rains through the site. So I'm talking about solutions, but we have many challenges already that we can see. The fact that, you know, we have different land use intensity, and obviously a bore site is different to a cutover site when it comes to water quality. But the duration of the drainage is important as well. And some cutover has been drained for many years, many decades. The remaining peat type, we have to have a regional approach to bog management, and obviously the importance of localized water storage feature. The key message really, all this supports the hypothesis that every managed bog need a management plan that is tailored to the site itself. Okay, so it's just we don't have a recipe to apply for every bog. We need a site tailored management plan for every managed bog. And just to thank then all my colleagues that work on both projects, but especially my postdoc, Kat Sheneki. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Flo. That was really very interesting. I think we have a little bit of time. Well, we don't really, but are we allowed a bit of time for questions?
2 minutes.
Okay. Well,
2 to 3. Yeah.
Right. Well, perhaps I'll kick off by just asking Flo now, in light of her experience on treating forested bogs, do you think that forests on upland blanket bogs should be encouraged?
Oh, you know, this has to come back now to the debate, because I thought we had passed that. Remember our bogland studies back in 2008 and 2008 and the IPS in Tullamore, we're all in agreement that, you know, blanket bogs and forestry, you know, this is not the good combo. So no, new forest plantation on blanket bogs is a no-no. The problem that we have is all the existing one. So that's what we need to manage, the existing ones. And I have to say that, you know, Quilcha is engaging in that. I hope they're going to talk about this tomorrow. Greenbelt, the private sector, the landowners are really also considering, well, what is it better to re-wet now, you know, in the long term, rather than have those rotation that are doing those crops that are doing poorly and are actually not as good as we expected in terms of climate and water. So now that we look at everything, you know, now that we know about everything, you know, we have to deal with the conversion. And I know Ken but we'll be also talking tomorrow, and there is options now to hopefully restore some of those sites as well, where it makes sense, especially for water quality.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thanks very much, Flo. We just got time. We've got one more question from for Kate Flood. And the question is, do you see potential for alternative rural economies that don't involve peat extraction?
Hi, Paul. Yeah, I think there is a lot of work on, diversifying rural economies going on, and, everything from, so this kind of idea of diverse economies, social enterprises, cooperatives, the care economy. I think in terms of, the LIFE project in the Midlands did employ, local contractors in doing the work. So, if restoration and rehabilitation is being scaled up, and if local contractors have the skills to do the work, then that would definitely be one option. I think ecotourism could be another potential, but you have to, I suppose, balance that as well. And I think really, though, it's about a kind of a wider economic, transformation, where, like the donut economics, the goal is not GDP, it's societal well-being and ecological well-being. And then you can see a lot of kind of work in terms of NGOs or different things like that. But I do think we need to transform our economic system. Yeah. Only a small thing, I know,
just a minor problem. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Just can I squeeze one more in, Catherine? And that's from Donald O'Keefe, and it's to Ray or to anybody else in dealing with Blanketbox. Do you see means of protecting Blanketbox waters for water supply? In other words, especially in the Dublin mountains, is there a realistic way of protecting, or how should they be protected in terms of the sources of water supply?
Yeah, I think part of that would key into what Laurence was talking about this just a moment ago, with regulating water tables to limit the degradation of peat, and that in turn will limit the delivery of colour and things such as ammonia, which would be constituents of concern. The real challenge we have with blanket bogs is the actual restoration techniques. Most of those techniques that have been developed have been essentially developed for raised bogs, which are flat. So when we put in things like dams and drains, etc., they back up for quite a substantial distance. When you're dealing with something on a slope, I think it's pretty easy to imagine, as that slope gets steeper, if we're using damming as the technology, it becomes progressively more difficult to actually back the water up to what Shane referred to as the Goldilocks zone, that 10 to 20 centimeter zone of a minimum water level. So there's a big challenge there. And unfortunately, some of the other techniques, such as bunding and that, again, they've been shown to work, as we'll see tomorrow, very well on some of the flatter raised bogs. But on the blanket bogs, putting something like the equivalent of a rice paddy made up of low specific gravity material on a steep slope is basically looking for trouble. One can just imagine slope failure. Not only would you have a degradation with water quality, we would probably have our own way of making bog bursts. So there's a lot of big challenges there, Donald. We're currently looking at a couple of techniques. Nothing has sort of come up as perfect yet, but it's early days, so I remain optimistic.
Good. Thank you very much, Ray. Yeah, we have to remain optimistic indeed. Thanks very much, everyone, for this final session after a long but very interesting and very productive day. So I'll hand back to Catherine.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for staying with us. Thanks to everybody on the call. We peaked at about 240 participants earlier on today, and I get the sense people are getting home to make dinner and pick up children and just get out and get a walk and enjoy that lovely autumn that is waiting for us outside. So really not much to say other than we have an amazing program tomorrow. So first up is Matthias Schouten. So, you know, Kate talked about removing the economic system that we have. And I listened to Matthias recently where he described speaking to an economist to understand how we could, you know, deconstruct the economic system, and the economists didn't know how it got there at all. So it's back to, you know, policy evolution. You start off with something and you stick on. It's like a house that you keep adding rooms onto that you can't figure out actually how it was made in the beginning. So Matthias has some wonderful stories for us that he's going to remind us of. And of course, he's, you know, the great father of the restoration of peatlands in this country. So I can't wait to hear from him. Then we're going to hear from Tina Claffey. And so I'm just sort of feeding your senses for the visuals that you're going to get in the morning. So please join us at 9:15. We'll have 3 sessions tomorrow. That will be followed by a summing up in the afternoon and a panel discussion with Minister Hackett, members from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, some experts in the EU CAP. Nuala from IPCC will be back with us, and Andrew on the legal side of the house, as well as a representative from the Irish Farmers Association, Geraldine. So Paddy Crushell said to me that he has spaces on his field trip in Kerry on Saturday. If anybody would like to contact Paddy Crushell to get out to see Ballygashean Bog. The last time I was there was to do some work for the Bogland project. And of course, check out the Bogcast. We will have some blogs on that on our Peatlands Gathering site over the next week or so. So really looking forward to listening to that excellent initiative by the PhD gang, the Peatland PhD gang. So, amen, the day is over. Go forth, have a good time this evening, relax, put the feet up, think about all the things we learned today, and so over and out. We'll see you in the morning. Slán agus Bannacht.